Imagine just for a second that you could take like a mental eraser to the way you look at the world.
Oh, that would be a pretty radical shift.
Right, because every time you see a wildly successful company or a viral meme, a brilliantly designed piece of software, or even just your own daily habits, I want you to stop asking the question, who decided this?
And replace it entirely with the question, what was selected for?
Yes, exactly. What was selected for? It's such a subtle shift in phrasing, but the implications of looking at reality through that specific lens are just, I mean, they're massive.
They really are. It forces you to look past the surface layer of human intention. You know, all those stories we tell ourselves about why things happen.
Yeah, the nice, tidy narratives.
Exactly. And instead, it forces you to look directly at the underlying mechanics governing the universe.
Which is actually our entire mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking this fascinating, honestly kind of mind-bending essay by Elias Kunis called Only Selection.
That's a great piece.
It really is. And the premise we're exploring is his argument that every single domain in our universe where complexity manages to persist, it's simply the exact same mechanism of selection, just operating on a different substrate.
Yeah, it's all the same process, just wearing different masks, basically.
Right.
But, you know, to really grasp Kunis's framework and how selection actually shapes our world, we kind of have to start at the foundational problem of the universe itself.
The big boss battle.
Exactly, because the universe has a very specific antagonist, and that antagonist absolutely hates structure.
Right. I mean, the universe leans toward disorder.
Yeah.
Left to its own devices, a pristine sandcastle just becomes a flat beach.
Yeah.
Or, a hot cup of coffee just becomes room temperature.
We're talking about the second law of thermodynamics here, entropy.
The dreaded entropy.
Yep. And to understand the mechanics of why entropy happens, it actually helps to think about it purely as like a mathematical inevitability.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about a brand new deck of playing cards.
Yeah.
It's perfectly ordered by suit and number, right?
Right, very satisfying.
Yeah, but there is exactly one specific arrangement that equals perfect order. Now, if you throw that deck into the air and let the cards fall on the floor...
The chances of them landing back in that exact sequence are effectively zero.
Right, because there are billions and billions of ways for the cards to be disorganized and only one way for them to be organized.
Ah, okay. So as time moves forward, the universe is essentially just shuffling the deck.
Exactly. Disorder isn't some magical evil force. It's just a statistical probability winning out over time.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's the core mechanism of entropy.
Right. Any complex structure you see around you, whether it's a living cell or a skyscraper or an economy, it's a localized violation of that statistical rule.
And it requires energy to maintain.
Always.
But wait, if the default rule of physics is that everything eventually dissolves into a chaotic mess, how does anything complex manage to survive at all? Like, why are we here?
Well, according to Kunis' framework, there are really only two viable strategies to persist against this constant pull of entropy.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first strategy is just simple stability. You resist the shuffling of the deck by being incredibly dense, simple, and durable.
Like a rock.
Exactly, like a massive granite rock, or even a single proton, which can last for billions of years. They don't do much, right? But their atomic bonds are so strong that they're just very hard to break down.
Yeah, but a rock isn't complex or dynamic. I mean, it survives, sure. But it makes me think of like a raft just floating passively down a really fast-moving river.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, so the river is entropy, and the raft is just letting the current take it wherever. It survives because it's sturdy wood, but it has zero agency. Like, it can't steer.
Which perfectly highlights the limitations of stability. And that introduces the second strategy, computation.
Computation.
Right. This is where a system resists entropy, not by being hard and simple, but by actively processing information.
Okay, so doing something about it.
Yeah. The system builds internal models of the outside world to navigate threats, extract energy from the environment, and constantly repair its own structure.
Okay, so going back to the river analogy, if the rock is the raft floating passively, computation is like a swimmer in that same river.
Spot on.
The swimmer is actively reading the currents, spotting the jagged rocks ahead, and paddling purposefully to avoid them. They're spending energy to fight the river's default path.
Exactly. And Kunis gives a specific name to these active swimmers. He calls them telic systems.
Telic systems.
Yeah, meaning they are goal-directed agents. So a single-celled bacterium is a telic system.
Okay.
A modern multinational corporation is a telic system. and advanced artificial intelligence is a telic system.
Wow, okay. So they all use computation to subordinate the laws of thermodynamics.
They do. They're actively fighting the problem of entropy to maintain their structure.
The problem is, though, the river still claims a lot of swimmers.
It definitely
It's
does.
like not every bacterium survives and not every corporation avoids bankruptcy.
And that is the exact entry point for selection.
Ah, there it is.
Right. Thermodynamics creates the universal problem, entropy. Telic systems try to fight the problem using computation. But because there is variance in the world,
Like genetic mutations or new business models.
exactly, mutations in biology, new business models in markets, new neural architectures and software. Because of that variance, there are millions of different computational strategies being tried all at once.
And selection acts as the ultimate filter?
Yes, the ultimate unforgiving filter. It ruthlessly removes any configuration that fails to navigate the physical constraints of reality.
Which means whatever happens to be left standing isn't necessarily the quote-unquote best in a moral sense, right? It's simply the specific configuration that worked.
Exactly. And this completely redefines the concept of aliveness.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, in this framework, aliveness isn't about, breathing oxygen or having a pulse.
Okay.
Aliveness is simply the capacity to pass that ultimate filter. It is the ability to run a computational strategy that successfully fends off entropy over deep time.
Wow. That kind of strips a lot of the mystical magic away from life, doesn't it?
It does.
But it replaces it with this incredibly elegant universal law, which I guess leads us to Kunis's concept of the map. Because if selection is just a mechanical filter for survival against entropy, it means this isn't contained to just biology.
Not at all. Biological evolution is merely selection operating on the substrate of genes.
Right?
But the exact same mathematical filter operates everywhere. Look at free markets. Markets are just selection operating on the substrate of firms.
And you see it in the scientific method too, right?
You.
Science is just selection operating on the substrate of theories. You throw a bunch of hypotheses at the wall of peer review and experimental data, and the rigorous testing filters out the ideas that don't match reality.
Yep. Culture is selection operating on memes and ideas. AI safety is selection operating on neural network architectures.
It's everywhere.
In every single one of these domains, there are dilemmas, which are the harsh constraints the system has to navigate. And there are virtues, which are the optimal syntheses, the specific solutions that manage to pass the filter.
Okay, I have to pause and push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because I understand the mechanics of genes and firms being filtered, but I struggle with applying this so rigidly to human behavior.
Okay, why is that?
Well, we love to tell stories about human agency. The brilliant CEO who stayed up all night, ran the numbers, and decided to pivot a company, saving it from ruin.
Right, the hero narrative.
Yeah. Or the genius scientist who had a deliberate eureka moment. Kunis's framework almost sounds like those conscious decisions don't actually matter. Like, are we just cogs in a giant selection machine?
That tension you're feeling is central to what Kunis calls his mechanist ontology.
Mechanist ontology, okay.
Right. And he isn't claiming that the CEO didn't make a conscious decision. The thought process obviously exists. But he argues that we suffer from massive survivorship bias.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. For every brilliant CEO who successfully pivoted their company, there were 1,000 other CEOs who also stayed up all night, made deeply intentional, logically sound decisions.
And completely destroyed their companies.
Exactly. We just don't write magazine covers about the 1,000 CEOs who failed. We only look at the one who survived, and we assume their survival was entirely due to their brilliant intention.
Ah. Physics and the environment set the constraints, but selection enforces them.
Precisely. We attribute success to human genius, but the mechanist ontology asks us to recognize that the environment simply filtered out all the firms that made the wrong bet.
Leaving behind the one that just happened to make the right one at the right time.
Exactly. The selection filter, not the individual intention, is the true author of the complexity we see.
Okay, replace who decided with what was selected for.
There you go.
If a company dominates a sector, it's because the market environment mathematically selected for its specific efficiency, regardless of how smart the boss felt.
Yeah.
It makes logical sense, but man, it is a profoundly ruthless way to view reality.
It is ruthless, which explains why human beings have spent our entire history trying to escape it. Natural selection is fundamentally cruel.
Yeah, I mean, it operates entirely through lethal consequences. Starvation, violence, disease, freezing to death.
Right. The entire project of human civilization has basically been an attempt to build a buffer against the cruelty of natural selection.
We didn't want to freeze, so we built shelter and walls. We didn't want to starve, so we invented agriculture and granaries. We developed medicine to fight disease. We systematically removed the lethality of our environment.
We achieved abundance.
We achieved abundance, but selection didn't stop.
No, it never does. And this is where Kunis introduces the concept of the inversion.
The inversion.
Right, selection never disappears, it just changes what it is selecting for based on the new environment. Under conditions of scarcity and high threat, the environment ruthlessly selects for a trait Kunis calls metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis. So representing continuous growth, risk-taking, capability building.
And adaptation. Because if you don't build capability in the wilderness, you are eaten.
Right. But under abundance, those constraints disappear.
The rules invert completely. Under absolute abundance, the immediate environment begins to select for homeostasis.
Okay, meaning comfort, safety, and risk avoidance.
Exactly. Because you are no longer in immediate danger, metabolic growth and capability building become optional. Comfort becomes cheap, heavily incentivized, and easily accessible.
You know, this reminds me of a very mundane personal realization I had recently about my phone's GPS.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like 10 years ago, I had a pretty decent internal sense of direction. I had to pay attention to street names and landmarks, or I would get hopelessly lost. I was forced to maintain that mental capability.
Right, you had to use it or lose it.
Exactly. But then I got a smartphone with flawless GPS. I basically turned on God mode for navigation.
God mode. I like that.
Yeah. The friction was gone. And today I realize I can barely navigate a few miles from my own house without a glowing blue line telling me where to turn. I completely offloaded the struggle and my capability just atrophied.
That GPS analogy perfectly scales up to explain what Kunis calls the axiological Malthusian trap.
Axiological. That relates to our values and ethics, right?
Exactly. Malthus famously theorized that population growth would eventually outstrip the food supply, creating a trap. But Kunis is saying this new trap isn't biological. It's driven by our values.
Okay.
By actively prioritizing our values of compassion, comfort, and safety over everything else, we construct an environment of extreme abundance.
And because that environment now selects for homeostasis, we lose the underlying capabilities required to maintain the complex infrastructure that provides the abundance in the first place.
Yes, we atrophy as a civilization.
Okay, and this is where Kunis diagnoses the modern West as rapidly accelerating this inversion.
Yes. Because natural selection was so historically cruel, we didn't just try to mitigate its rough edges. We decided the very concept of selection of people failing or suffering consequences was morally wrong.
We built an entire worldview based on what he calls feedback severance.
Feedback severance. Literally severing the causal link between an action and its outcome.
Okay, now, before we look at Kunis's examples of this, I really want to invite our listeners to put on their cold, clinical physicist hats with us.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, because Kunis is taking massive, deeply held social institutions that we usually view through a moral or political lens, and he is analyzing them strictly as mechanical systems with inputs and outputs. And we need to be super clear here. We are just impartially reporting Kunis's philosophical arguments to you, the listener.
Right. We are absolutely not endorsing these viewpoints or taking any political sides here. We're just conveying the ideas exactly as they appear in the source text.
Exactly. So with that clinical framing, how does he apply this feedback severance?
Well, for instance, he points to universal human rights as the institutionalization of the idea that survival should not depend on capability.
Okay.
He views the modern welfare state as the manifestation of the idea that access to resources should not depend on contribution.
And it extends into culture too, right? With safetyism, the rising belief that no one, especially not a child or student, should ever have to experience emotional distress or the friction of failure.
Yes, and even applies this to artificial intelligence, specifically targeting RLHF.
RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. That's how almost all major AI chatbots are currently trained to be polite and helpful, right?
Exactly. Kunis argues that RLHF is a form of feedback severance.
Wait, how is an AI being polite a bad thing?
Well, because it trains the AI to optimize for what makes the human user feel good and validated in the moment, rather than optimizing for what is objectively true or capable.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it basically severs the AI from the harsh feedback of reality and feeds it a diet of human sycophancy.
Man, the tension here is so palpable because all of these things, welfare, safety, polite AI, They're born out of deep human empathy. We want a kind world. We don't want people to starve or suffer anxiety.
And Kunis readily acknowledges that empathy. He explicitly notes that the goal of a complex civilization should be to reduce the cost of failure.
Right, we want bad ideas to die instead of people dying.
Exactly. That is the triumph of human progress. But the fatal error isn't reducing the cost of failure. The fatal error is severing the feedback loop entirely.
Because when outcomes are completely decoupled from inputs, the selection filter shatters. It mathematically cannot do its job.
Nope. It can no longer distinguish the fit from the unfit, the capable from the incapable, or the true from the false.
And when computation and selection stop, entropy wins by default.
The deck of cards gets shuffled.
Yeah.
And Kunis calls the ultimate destination of this feedback, severance, the hospice.
The hospice.
Yeah. We set out to build a utopia of kindness, but by insulating everyone and everything from the consequences of failure, we create a system where nothing is forced to learn. Everything is comfortable, nothing feels pain, but the underlying structure slowly and inevitably decays.
That is a haunting paradox. The ultimate compassionate move, protecting everything from the friction of reality, actually becomes the most destructive move possible because it guarantees terminal decay for the entire system, which is comfortably rot away. So what is the path out of this? Like, we can't dismantle civilization and go back to the brutal wilderness where failure means getting eaten by a bear.
Right. Nobody wants that.
But we also can't stay in the hospice.
So the only viable path forward, according to his framework, is artificial selection.
Artificial selection?
Yeah. We must consciously engineer selection pressures that favor metamorphosis, that force growth, adaptation, and capability building, but without the lethality of the natural world.
Okay, so it's about finding the medium cost.
Exactly.
Because natural selection has a brutally high cost. You make a mistake, you literally die. Inverted selection, the hospice, has zero cost up front. Nobody fails, everyone passes, but the whole civilization eventually collapses under its own incompetence.
You've got it. Artificial selection introduces a medium cost. You fail, it hurts, but you live to learn from it.
Okay, do we have any examples of this working?
We actually already have successful models of this. Healthy financial markets are a form of artificial selection.
Oh, right. They mercilessly select for efficiency.
Yeah. If a firm fails to adapt, bankruptcy is a highly painful, negative feedback loop. But the employees don't starve to death, they just re-enter the labor pool. The bad business model dies, not the humans.
Ah, okay. Academic and professional exams are another great example then.
Absolutely.
Like, if you want to be a surgeon, you have to pass your medical boards. If you don't study, you fail.
And failing hurts your pride, it costs you money, it delays your career. It is a real, friction-filled consequence.
But it selects for competence safely, keeping incompetent surgeons out of the operating room without executing them.
Right. And Kunis also points to constitutional AI as the technological equivalent.
Wait, instead of RLHF?
Exactly. Instead of RLHF, which just trains the AI to please us, constitutional AI mathematically embeds hard constraints, a constitution, directly into the model's training loss function.
So if the AI violates core principles of truth or alignment, it is mathematically penalized during training.
Yes. It creates an artificial selection pressure that forces the system to maintain its integrity, even when it's uncomfortable.
That makes a lot of sense. Which brings us to the final, incredibly ambitious proposal in the essay, Kunis's vision for the fourth branch.
This is wild. If you accept that feedback loops are the only thing preventing societal decay, Kunis envisions a future where we recognize this dynamic so clearly that we establish an entirely new pillar of governance.
The fourth branch of government.
Right. Operating alongside the executive, legislative, and judicial branches.
And what would it do?
Its sole mandate would be the maintenance of artificial selection.
What would that actually look like in practice, though? Like an institution dedicated to making sure things are difficult.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But think of it somewhat like a central bank or an antitrust regulator. Only its currency is friction and accountability.
Okay.
Its job would be to constantly audit the massive systems of society. Our educational institutions, our corporate monopolies, our technological infrastructure, just to ensure they haven't achieved feedback severance.
It would actively break up God modes wherever it finds them.
Yes. Ensuring that complex systems still possess healthy, medium-cost failure states.
Man, that turns our traditional view of institutions completely upside down.
It really does.
Because we usually build institutions to act as safety nets, right? To protect us from failure. But the fourth branch is an institution whose explicit purpose is to protect our right to fail safely.
Exactly. It exists to ensure that the environment continues to select for truth, competence, and capability, constantly fighting the gravitational pull of abundance that wants to drag us into the hospice. It is the institutionalization of the fight against entropy, because while physics might set the mathematical constraints of the universe, selection is the only force capable of enforcing them.
This has been a massive journey of an essay. Let me just trace the through line of everything we've covered today for you.
Yeah, let's recap.
We started with the mathematical reality of entropy, the universe's statistical preference for disorder. We learned that the only way to fight that decay is through computation and adaptation, and that everything from biological genes to human civilizations is shaped by the exact same mechanism of selection filtering out what doesn't work.
Yep.
Then we saw how our success in escaping the cruelty of natural selection accidentally inverted our environment. It pushed us away from capability and towards comfort, building a societal hospice characterized by feedback severance.
The inertia.
The inversion, exactly. And finally, we explored the narrow path forward, engineering safe, medium-cost artificial selection pressures, and perhaps even creating new institutions to ensure we keep ourselves sharp.
It is a remarkable mechanistic lens through which to view human progress. And, if we carry this logic forward, particularly regarding our rapid development of artificial intelligence, it leaves us with a rather profound thought experiment to consider.
Oh, a parting thought experiment. I love it. What are we left with?
Well, if we fully commit to building the ultimate utopia of comfort, if we successfully develop superintelligent AI systems to solve all of our problems, cure all of our diseases, and shield us from every possible friction or failure, what happens to the biological humans?
Oh.
Right. Kunis's framework suggests that the AI, tasked with navigating the harsh constraints of reality to keep the system running, will be the entity forced to undergo constant metamorphosis.
Because it's doing the computing.
Exactly. The machines will face the selection pressures. But the humans, by severing all of our own feedback loops, will we inadvertently evolve into the obsolete, perfectly coddled pets of our own creations, living out our days in a completely meaningless hospice built by machines.
Oh, man. Will we become the pets in a hospice built by our own AI?
It's a possibility.
That is a brilliantly unsettling question to end on. It really forces you to reevaluate the friction in your own life. The universe is always shuffling the deck, and it is always selecting for something. The question is whether you are actively choosing the friction that builds capability or passively accepting the comfort that leads to decay. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.